Thank you.
All of our tefillas, we're learning in the schos of all of our sisters and brothers in Eretz HaKodesh and all the holy soldiers and the pilots, and in the schos of the hostages, and that we should see the Yeshua. We should Yatzavu v'yiru, Yeshua is Hashem.
Amen.
We want to wish Mazel Tov to all the mothers and the grandmothers on various graduations in this last week and in this coming week. Daniela's granddaughter, Hannah Labor Wells, had a baby boy. Mazel Tov on your new great-grandson. And to Esther Freeman, Mazel Tov on her grandson's upshernish. And this should just be simchas, and the bracha that we have, that should be with Chelek HaHerz, it should be with happy hearts. We should be able to have simchas, and it should be with happy hearts. We're learning the Sicha and Chelek Chavches, Shelach, Beis. It's a short, a jewel of a Sicha. We know that in Parsha Shelach, the main story, the main event, is the Meraglim, is the group of scouts or spies that were sent to do a reconnaissance and see what's going on in Eretz Canaan, was to become Eretz Yisrael. And Hashem said to Moshe, okay, shlach lecha, it's going to be on your responsibility because your people are asking for this. And we all know that the result wasn't positive for the men. The women never got ensnared in this avera. But in this week's parsha, there's also another story, and that is the story about the Mekoshesh Eitzim, a man named Tzalafchat, who violated the laws of Shabbos. He was Mechalel Shabbos, and he was killed for this. And in this Sikha, the Rebbe explains the connection between this story, which seems to be kind of almost out of place, with the overarching theme of the Chet HaMeraglim. Si'if Aleph. B'Seif Parsha Seinu, at the end of our Parsha, in Shvi'i, in the 7th Aliyah, Hevi, and at the very end, actually, Hevi Rashi b'Perusha b'Shem Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan. So Rashi brings in his commentary, in the name of Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan, Lama Nismecha Parshas Mekoshesh LeParshas Avodas Alilim. What is the connection? Because Rashi does this a number of times, where he talks about the juxtaposition of certain concepts upon each other based on their proximity in the Torah. And he says, what is the connection between the story of the Mekoshesh Eitzim, the wood chopper, the one that was Mechalel Shabbos, and Avodas Alilim and idol worship, which immediately precedes the story about the Mekoshesh Eitzim? And Rashi answers, Loimar, to teach, to tell us, Shamechalel es HaShabbos ka'ovid Avodas Alilim, that somebody who transgresses, who trespasses the laws of Shabbos, it's as if he worshipped idols. Sha'af hi shkul kechol mitzvahs, because just like idol worship, transgressing the laws of Shabbos, that's equal to all the other mitzvahs. So both of these mitzvahs have enormous gravity, and that's why they are found next to each other. V'hat Taisves kasvu. And Taisves in the Gemara writes about the juxtaposition of this story and where it's found in this parsha, and addresses it from a different perspective, not about Avodas Alilim, but about the overarching story of the Meraglim. And the Taisves says, Maise HaMekoshesh hayu betchilas arba'im miyad acher Maise Meraglim. First of all, the Taisves says, chronologically, when did this happen? It happened at the very beginning of the 40 years that the Jews spent in the desert. It happened immediately after the story with the Meraglim. The Amar b'Medrash, and the Taisves cites a Medrash, and the Medrash says, the L'Shem Shamayim Niskavein, that the whole story of the Mekoshesh Eitzim, the whole thing that Tzalafchat did was L'Shem Shamayim. Why? Shehayu Eimrim Yisrael, because the Jews were saying, Kevan shenigzar alein shaloi likanes la'eretz mimaisa meraglim. Once they realized that it was decreed upon them that they would not go into Eretz Yisrael because of the sin with the Meraglim, shuv ein mechuyavim b'mitzvahs. So we're not mechuyavim mitzvahs, because mitzvahs is mainly an inyan that has to do with Eretz HaKodesh. And since we're not going in, this is not our inyan. When Tzlafchat saw this, Ahmad, he got up, the Chilel Shabbos, and he was Mechalel Shabbos b'far Hesia. He publicly transgressed the laws of Shabbos, Kidei sheyaharig v'yiru acherim, in order that he should be killed for this, and other people would see / other people would fear the ramifications. Okay, that's what the Tosfos says. Olafize muvenes. So based on the Tosfos, it's understood. Gam smichus parshas mekoshish lechlalos parshasenu. So earlier in the first paragraph, the Rebbe started with what Rashi says, that there's a connection between Avodah Salilim, Avodah Zara, and the story of the Mekoshish Eitzim. Now the Rebbe is saying that Tosfos says there's a connection between the Mekoshish Eitzim and the story of the Meraglim. And he says about this parsha, Sheba midubar edes chetim meraglim, shehu ikar hasipor b'parshasenu. The main event, the main story in our parsha is the Meraglim. Va'al shemoy nikras kol haparsha, parsha Shelach, and it is the name of the parsha. And we know from numerous sichas, innumerable sichas, that the Rebbe opines that the name encapsulates the entire parsha. Because the whole story of the Mekoshish Eitzim, the wood chopper, is a result of the story of the Meraglim. However, Parshas Avodah Salilim Nichtava B'Torah Bein Parshas Meraglim and Parshas Mekoshish, but from the fact that there is this discussion about Avodah Zarah that is nestled between the story of the Meraglim and the story of the Mekoshish Eitzim, move on, it's understood. Shagam l'das haTosfos shayeches parshas Mekoshish l'parshas Avodah Salilim. That although the Tosfos, the Rebbe brought down, is saying that the story of the Mekoshish Eitzim is connected to the story of the Meraglim, but even Tosfos would agree that it's also connected to Avodah Zarah. Al derech, the drashas Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan shehevi Rashi, in consonance with what Moshe Hadarshan, that Rashi cites, says about the connection with Avodah Zarah and the Mekoshish Eitzim. And then the Rebbe says, "U'kamoshe kasav haTosfos." He brings a different Tosfos, bevir divrei haGemara, and this is Tosfos on the words of the Gemara. The Gemara says, "Yodeya haya Moshe Rabbeinu shahamekoshish b'misa." Moshe Rabbeinu knew that the sin of trespassing the laws of Shabbos, and therefore the sin of the wood chopper, has to be met with a punishment of death. Shen Ne'emar, because it already says in Parshas Kisisa, Mechalaleha Ma'is Yumas. The one that is going to be Mechalel Shabbos is going to die. But the Gemara says, Avaloi Haya Yodea Be'ezem Misa. But he didn't know which of the 4 capital punishments should be applied in this case. So what does the Tosfos say? The afal gav de misa stam cheneki, that although the default punishment, when the Torah doesn't say exactly how the death should occur, the default is strangulation, chenek, choking. However, mitay chasvara, but the Moshe Rabbeinu applied a certain logic, hayamidame la'eved avodas kachavim, de beskila. He compared trespassing Shabbos with serving idols, which is met with the punishment of stoning. What was his svara? What was the logic? The mechalel Shabbos b'far hesia kekoifer beikar, the koifer b'maisa precious. Because just like idol worship is koifer beikar, you're repudiating the main thing, the ikar, which is that there's one Eibishter, there's only one boss. The same thing when you violate Shabbos, what are you doing? You're repudiating Ma'aseh Bereishis. You're repudiating that there's one creator, that there's one God, that there's one boss. So what is the Rebbe doing here? He is solidifying that there has to be a connection between these three things. The story of the Meraglim, Avodah Zarah, and the story of the Mekoshesh Eitzim. And he's going to take us into the profound connection between these three things. Okay. But this is one of the most amazingly beautiful hallmarks of the Rebbe Sichos, where it seems that there are these disparate teachings, right? There's what Rashi says, there's what Tosfos says, and the Rebbe says, no, it all has to be connected, and he finds another Tosfos that kind of sews it together. Okay, so that's where we are. The Yesh Lahaisip, and the Rebbe says that we should add Shaykh Chazu being Parshas Mekoshes or Parshas Avodas Alilim, he rak biyachas le'etzem hachet dechilul Shabbos Avodas Zarah. That on the face of it, it would seem that the connection between the Mekoshesh Eitzim and Avodas Zarah is relevant to the essence of the sin, as he just finished saying in the last paragraph, that in both cases you're being kaifer be'ikar. You're pushing back at the most important thing in Jewish theology. But the Rebbe says, Ach mizeh shesmichazu eina lechet chilul Shabbos stam. But the Rebbe is not happy with just talking about Shabbos generally. He says, but the fact that these two things are found one next to the other, they're adjacent to each other in the Torah, means that there's a connection not just to Chilul Shabbos in the most general way, because as we know, there are many, many ways in which you could be Mechalel Shabbos. But he says, Ella lechetoi shel hamekoshesh dafka. But there is a profound connection between this particular sin and Avodas Alilim. Mistaber loimar, it's logical to conclude sheparshas Avodas Alilim yesh l'shaychas la'oifen chilul hashabbos shel hamekoshes d'lashem shamayim niskavein. That we need to pay attention to the connection between Avodah Zarah and how this sin of the Mekoshesh is described. And Tosfos cites the medrash that says, "D'lashem shamayim niskave," that he only did it for the sake of heaven. This was not a man that got bored and decided to go chop wood on a Shabbos morning, or a dafkanik that wanted to rebel. The opposite. He did it l'shem shamayim. V'yesh loimar, might say, shechevon shekol hanal hu chelek miparsha Shelach, and because Avodas Alilim, the mention of Avodah Zarah, and the story of the Mekoshesh is part of Parsha Shelach, she'ikra hi Parshas HaMeraglim, and the main story of Parsha Shelach is Meraglim, haregam inyan zeh yesh l'shayches l'teichen ma'aseh Meraglim. So now the Rebbe says that we're going to find a profound connection between the inyan of the Meraglim, Avodah Zarah, and the exact way and reasoning that this sin of the Mekoshesh Eitzim was enacted. Base. V'yuvan, I will understand this, b'haktim, by prefacing, habir b'divrei hamedrash shehevi Tosfos. The Rebbe says, first, we're going to look into an explanation on the medrash that the Tosfos brings down. And again, the Rebbe cites it again. D'lashem shamayim niskave, that the Mekoshesh did this for the sake of heaven. Shahayu Aimim Yisrael, because the Jews were saying, once they realized that they weren't going to go into Eretz Yisrael because of the story of the Meraglim, Shuv ein mechuyavim b'mitzvahs. So we're not mechuyav b'mitzvahs, because mitzvahs is mainly something that's going to apply in Eretz Yisrael. We're not going in, so it's not for us. Amad v'chilel Shabbos. So Tzlavchad got up. He was mechalel Shabbos in public after having been warned not to do it. Kidei sheyaharig v'yiru acherim, in order that he should be killed in order that others should see, in order that others should take away a lesson. Now, l'chayra, seemingly, im kidei laharish b'nei Yisrael adayim mechuyavim b'mitzvahs, if this is all about showing b'nei Yisrael that they are still mechuyav b'mitzvahs, even though they're not going to go into Eretz Yisrael, lama hayitzarek l'chalas haShabbos dafka? Why choose such a serious breach of Torah mitzvahs? Take another mitzvah. Ubifrat, and especially shahadavar hevi la'id chet gadol b'yaser, because undertaking this particular sin led to another very, very serious sin, and that is committing suicide. On the words of Parshas Noach, as dimchem l'nafshesechem, shefech dam atzmai. Because shekain hu gerim la'atzma sheyaharek. Because by doing this sin of being mekoshesh eitzim, he effectively was committing suicide. He knew that he would be killed. He was doing it for the purpose of getting killed. Why would he do such a thing? Bisha shahayachal lahareis davar zeh al yidei aver al mitzvah cheres. He could have made the same point that mitzvahs are just as relevant to us as they would have been if we were to go into Eretz Yisrael now in the Midbar. He could have made that same point. Va'afilu al chet kal b'yoser. He could have done it with a less serious transgression. Hamechayvei malkais. Could have done it with a sin for which he would get lashes, or mamain, a monetary fine, something like that. But why mechalol Shabbos b'farhesia? Gam b'targum Yonasan huva klolos teichen zeh. The Targum Yonasan also addresses this content. Shahamekoshesh eitzim lo hiskavin l'chalol Shabbos b'mezid ella l'shem shemayim niskavin. We're not talking about a person that set out to be mechalol Shabbos on purpose. We're talking about a person that did it l'shem shemayim. Aval Targum Yonasan mevar gam lo muhutzach l'chalol Shabbos dafka. The Targum Yonasan, however, adds why he chose this particular transgression. And he says, Kevan she'az yadu Yisrael rak as gezeira shapta, because at that time in history, the Jews knew about Shabbos. They had been given the mitzvah of Shabbos. V'ilu ha'einesh al chilul Shabbos. Konsa de shapta, lo yishtamuda lahain. But they didn't know the punishment for transgressing Shabbos. Ha'isa kavanas hamakoshesh al yedei masav. So his intention was that through his actions, ishtamuda kansa de Shabbos l'chol beis Yisrael. That through his actions, the punishment for transgressing Shabbos will be known to all of the house of Israel. Avalafi hamedrash hamuva b'Taisvis. But the Rebbe says, but going back to the medrash that the Taisvis brings down, shemaisa hamekoshesh hayikadei laharis the Yisrael shadayin heim michuyavim b'mitzvos. That the whole point was to teach the Jews that they are still, even though they're not going to Eretz Yisrael, mechuyav b'mitzvos, adayin ein muvan. It's still not understood. Mipnei ma asa zois al yidei chilul Shabbos dafka kanal. Okay, it's true. The Targum Yonasan tells us that he wants to teach them about the punishment. But this seems like a very, very extreme way to telegraph this particular piece of information. Maybe he could have made a town hall meeting and told everybody what the punishment is. But he actually committed himself to death by doing this. Why? The Habir Bazeh. And the Rebbe says, there's an explanation, Al Pi Divrei HaMarsha. The Marsha brings down the following explanation: B'mayin el she'ela keitzat chilal hamekoshes haShabbos kidei lo hediya be'ezem misa danim es hamachalal. How could he have done such a thing to be machalal Shabbos and to commit himself to death in order to let other people know that a machalal Shabbos is judged as a capital offense? So the Marsha teaches as follows. Because Tzalafchad did not need the wood. He didn't need the wood. He didn't need the the wood chopping implement. He wasn't doing this because he needed the malacha. Ella leda be'ezay misa chule. But it was only because he wanted to teach what happens when you're mechalel Shabbos. Havale melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. So what you have here is a melacha where you do something, but you actually don't need the item with which you're doing the melacha. Kimoi brings down an example. Chayfer guma ve'ena tzarech ela la'afra. Like somebody who digs a hole in the earth, but he doesn't need the hole. He just needs the soil. So instead of going to Agway, he makes a hole in the earth. Okay. So now this is not the quintessential malacha. The quintessential malacha is when you make a hole because you need the hole. People used to make holes in the earth to store things. It was colder, whatever reasons they used to do this kind of thing. And there is a machlekes about this in the Gemara. And on this halacha, who pater l'Reb Shimon. According to Reb Shimon's opinion, a person who makes a hole on Shabbos, of course, it's a d'Rabbanan, of course, it's not what you should do on Shabbos, but you're pater from a trespass of the malacha of chafira. This seems the Marsha ends the chen yesh leimer lefia medish kasvei taisveis. So we could apply the same reasoning to what the Medrash is telling us about Salafchad. That what you have here before you is a malacha that was done, but it's not tzarech legufa. You don't need it for the reason that the malacha is usually done, and therefore he was pater. Move on. So based on this, we'll understand Lashitas HaMedrash HaMuva b'Taisvos, according to what the Medrash is teaching us that the Taisvos brings down. Hatam Shamikoishish Hadias Hadavar Al Yidei Melacha b'Shabbos Dafka. Why did he telegraph this most important information that you're mechuyev and mitzvahs in the midbar, and also what happens when you're mechalel Shabbos? Why did he do it dafka like this? Lefisha bikesh, because what he wanted to do was lasis maisa shelo yeh b'chet. He wanted at the same time to do something that's not actually a sin. Aval b'yachad imzeh yavi lebirur hanal. But at the same time, he will clarify the above-mentioned teachings. V'davar ze efshari b'surei Shabbos dafka. And this particular paradigm is possible dafka in the rubric of the law surrounding Shabbos. De malacha she'ena tzricha legofa patur alel Reb Shimon. Ukamei shekasa b'kedushas Levi imkein leichilel Shabbos klal. Rabbi Yitzchak Barditcha writes, if you understand it this way, he wasn't Mechalel Shabbos at all. But yet, it appeared as if he was Mechalel Shabbos, and therefore he was killed by the Beis Din, and therefore he was able to teach Bnei Yisrael this all-important lesson. But at the same time, he didn't trespass Shabbos, be'etzem, essentially. So he didn't separate himself even for one moment from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Gimel. Ba'af al pikein Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu LaMoshe Mois Yumas Ha'ish Rogum Oisai. And even though we now understand that he didn't actually do an Avera, still in all, Hashem said to Moshe, because as you know, Moshe didn't exactly know what to do with the Mekosha She'itzim, so we had him sequestered, and he asked Hashem, what should I do with him? And Hashem said, this man has to die, Rogum Oisai, you have to stone him. Hainu, this means Shahaya Mechuyev Misa, that he was Chayav Misa. Av sheklape Shmaya Galia Shahisazu Malacha Sheina Tzricha Legufa, even though it was revealed in heaven, Klape Shmaya, of course Hashem knew that it wasn't an Avera, because it was I don't want to say it wasn't Avera, it wasn't a trespass of the Melacha, of the Av Melacha. Ulashem Shemayim Niskavin. And of course, Hashem knows what drove him to do this in the first place, that it's all L'Shem Shemayim. V'af lo yichilel Shabbos klal, and even bringing down the words of the Kedushas Levi, He wasn't Mechalel Shabbos at all. Not only was he not Mechalel Shabbos, but his whole action was to strengthen and bolster the observance of Shabbos. Kavanasa ha'isa shetischazek shmiras haShabbos. V'kiyam ha'torah v'mitzvah b'chlal etzel b'nei Yisrael. His entire intention was to strengthen Shmiras Shabbos specifically, and more generally, Kiyum Torah mitzvahs amongst all of Bnei Israel. And yet, Hashem said he has to be stoned. Umevar HaMarsha Sham, the Marsha explains there, Dahainu mishum shelo yadu ha'edim shehutru boi, shehu asa zois al dazu, ve'enan ela dvarim shebelev, ve'danin hayu oiseh lemisa al pi ha'edus. The Marsha explains why did this happen, or how does this happen? Because the Edim that gave him Hasra, that gave him warning, they didn't know what's going on in his mind and in his heart. These are only things that are in the heart. So they had to judge him to Misa al Pia Edus. They had to follow the laws of the Torah. Now, in the footnotes, in a few places, the Rebbe brings down that if and when, in such a case, a person was tried lemisa, then this means that this is what had to happen to that person. In other words, there's no imperfection, there's no glitch, there's no two things happening at the same time that actually, he had to die to make an example of himself, but really he wasn't supposed to die, according to halacha. No. Brings down a number of places where it's clear that, of course, everything is orchestrated and this person had to leave this world at this moment. But the Marsha is explaining that, in Das Tachten, in our logic, why did it have to happen this way? Because yes, we're taught that the Mekashish Eitzim had this exalted kavana. And it's true that he didn't even need the wood, he didn't need the help me here, the axe, none of this. So he didn't do the malacha. But the way it appeared. And the Edim saw this, and the Edim warned him, and he went ahead and did it anyway. So the protocol has to be followed. And here the Rebbe is saying, even in the pnim of the Sikha, the pshat is not that they stoned him mistakenly, because they only got what they got, what their eyes see, what their mind can tell them. They don't have X-ray vision of his heart and his mind. But the Rebbe says, no, you have to disabuse yourself of thinking that this is a glitch, that this is an imperfection, it's a mistake. Shariat Torah hi Torah's emes. Because the Torah is the Torah of truth. The im lefia emes mitzat kavanasa lo yichil al Shabbos klal lo haya kadosh baruch hu mitzav emes yumas ha'ish gomer. And if, according to the ultimate truth, his kavana was not to be Mechalel Shabbos, if that was 100% true on every single level, then Hashem would not have commanded that he should be killed. Ella, shechiyuv haskila bedine adam al piteres emes hu al hamaise v'hapeula. And now we have come to the jugular here. This is the heart of the Sikha. That the chiyuv of his being stoned, when it comes to the Dine Adam, when it comes to the system of law, is in Teres Emes, is on the action. Al hamaise v'hapeula. The kevan shemaaseyu haya maise shechil Shabbos. So irrespective of what he was thinking, and irrespective of what he intended, and irrespective of his exalted level, but since his action was the action of Chilul Shabbos, Hari al Pidin based in Shalmata, Zuhi Pu'ula Shechayavim Allah Skila. According to the laws and the protocols of the Beis Din in this world, this is an action that that leads to being stoned. The Kavanasa Eina Negaas Klal. And what his intention was is not relevant here. Al pizeh muvenes shaychus parshas mekoshes leparshas avodah zarah. So now the Rebbe says, once we understand this, we're in a position to understand the link between the Mekoshesh, Eitzim, and the laws about Avodah Zarah that precede this story. Be'isra Avodah Zarah, matzinu inin miyuchad, shaloi nimtza b'shar mitzvahs haTorah. Regarding the prohibition of serving Avodah Zarah, we find something distinctive that is unparalleled in any other mitzvah. And that is, and the Rebbe brings down even the words from Tanya, Kol Yehudi, afilu kal shebekalim, every Jew, even a Jew that's not so stringent, generally speaking, when it comes to the test of Avodah Zarah, the scenario of Avodah Zarah, harehu meiser nafshay afilu shaloi lasis rak eze meiser levad neged abunas Hashem echad. We see that every Jew is careful, so much so that he'd be ready to give up their life, not to do any action against belief in one God. For instance, like to bow to Avodah Zarah, even though he doesn't believe in it at all. Okay, so the famous story of Chana v'Shiva Banel comes to mind, right? All the king wanted was performer, just perform for me, just bow down. No. V'tzarich biur. And this actually requires understanding and explanation. Because Iker chet Avodah Zarah hu be'emunah shebelev. Because what are we talking about in Avodah Zarah? Isn't it all about what you believe in your heart? B'kach she'adam machshiv lemetzius milvad HaKadosh Baruch Hu echad mikol habruim. The Iker of Avodah Zarah is when a person believes something that was created by God to be an existence that is independent. For instance, ascribing such powers to an angel, to a constellation, Galgal, Eikechav, or to a particular star. And he accepts upon himself this service as if he's serving a god. But what happens if this Jew doesn't believe at all in this star, in this angel, in this constellation? This is not the Avera of Avodah Zarah, and see how the word loy is underscored. The loy hifrid atzmai mekadosh baruch hu, and he has not separated himself from God. And conversely, afilu lo yimasar nafshay el kach. And if the Jew didn't, he didn't sacrifice his life in such a scenario, eino nenash. It's true that a Jew should sacrifice himself, but if he didn't, after the case, he's not punished. Because he was forced to do this. Because the king said, bow down. The king said to the youngest of Chana's sons, pick up my ring. He was forced to do it. So after the fact, if you weren't Meiser Nefesh, you wouldn't be punished. Umikol Makim. So after the Rebbe proves that Avodah Zarah is all about what's going on in your heart and your mind, but still in all, because what we're talking about here is an action that is connected to and is an expression of Avodah Zarah. So even though it doesn't possess the content of the sin, which is about your heart, which is about your mind, nechshav hadavar be'ena Yehudi kan ba'olam hazeh l'avodah zarah. But this is still considered, to most Jews that live in this world, this is avodah zarah. V'hu meiser nafshay el zeh, and he gives up his life for this. V'zehu hemshach inyanim to parshas mekoshesh eitzim b'yom hashabbos u'parshas avodah zarah. And now we can understand the trajectory in the Torah and the connection between Avodah Zarah and the story of Mekoshesh Eitzim. Melecha Shabbos, doing melacha on Shabbos, kol teichna miyusad al machshavdoi v'kavanasei shel ha'adam. When you learn halacha and you learn about the melachas, you learn that it's meleches machsheves asra Torah, that it's specifically a melacha that is, help me here, somebody that's looking at the English, help me with the meleches machsheves, that it's when you intend to do that melacha, that's what's forbidden. Anybody have a better terminology?
You said intent, but there's maybe intentional.
Yeah, with intention.
With intention, okay? So that's the whole essence of a malacha. V'lachein, and therefore, eina chayav al malacha she'eina tzricha legufa. And that's precisely why, if you dig a hole on Shabbos, which is a malacha, but you didn't dig it for the purpose of the hole, you dug it for some reason because you needed soil, so you're not over on the malacha. Ubefrat b'nidin didan, and especially in this case with the Mekoshesh Eitzim, Shemaaseu Haya L'Shem Shemayim. It's not just that he didn't need the chopped wood. He wasn't doing it b'chlal for any physical reason. He was doing it L'Shem Shemayim. The nimtza she'ein ze ma'aseh shechil Shabbos klal. So there's actually nothing here that's chilul Shabbos. Va'af al bikain, and still in all, but because this was an action, as it appears to the naked eye in this physical world, it appears as an action that is chilul Shabbos. Because the fact that he didn't need the wood, that wasn't something that anybody that was watching him could know or see. Hari al piteres emes. So according to Teres Emes, according to the protocols, according to the system that the Eibush set up, he was chayiv skila, he was stoned. Now, the Rebbe is going to, with this new understanding, take us in to the profound connection between these two actions and the story of the Meraglim. Al pikola nal tuvan gam ashayches beteichen shel ma'aseh hamekoshesh lemaaseh meraglim. Now we're in a position to understand the connection between the essence of what the Mekoshesh was doing and the essence of the story of the Meraglim. Mivur bekama mekaymes. The Rebbe says this has been explained in many places. There are so many sichas that explain what the Meraglim set out to do. It's not what it appears. Shahatam shebikshu hameraglim lihishar b'midbar v'loy ratzu likanes l'Eretz Yisrael hu. Why did the Meraglim want to stay in the desert? Why did they not want to enter Eretz Yisrael? Ki ikar asakam shel b'nei Yisrael b'midbar, because the main avocation of the Jews in the desert, makom shelo niskaku lihitari by be'esak haparnasa b'chulei. The desert was a place where they did not need to busy themselves with pedestrian things, like making a living, like planting crops, like reaping the crops, and so on and so forth. So what did they do? What was their main vocation and avocation? They learned Torah. Chazal, and like we learn in the Mechilta, that it was only those that ate the man that could really understand the Torah, because they were able to immerse themselves in it night and day to the exclusion of all other things. And now what is it when you learn Torah? What's ikra? What's the main thing of learning? Havana v'hasaga b'seichel u'machshava. The main thing of learning Torah is to understand and to grasp the concepts with your cognition, with your seichel. V'gam hamshechasei v'halbashasei b'dibor, and then internalizing it, integrating it, and vesting it in speech, communicating it. Masha'en came be'eretz Yisrael, But in contradistinction, what was going to be the main thrust of spiritual service in Eretz Yisrael? Asher ba shei shonim tizra sadecha gaimer tizmar karmecha. The Torah says you're going to go into Eretz Yisrael 6 days out of every week, 6 years out of every 7 years. You're going to be busy with agricultural pursuit. Ubipnimius, and on a deeper level, Ikar Havoida be'Eretz Yisrael hu hamaisa. So the main avoda of the Dar Hamidbar, the Dar that ate the man, was limud hatayra. But the main avoda of those that went into Eretz Yisrael was going to be maisa, was going to be actions, mitzvahs maisias, practical mitzvahs, ubifrat kiyam hamitzvahs atluyas ba'aretz, and specifically the many mitzvahs that have to do with agricultural pursuits. Umaisim tovim b'chlal, and generally good deeds, uvdin tovin, good deeds. That was going to be a very different orientation in Avodas Hashem. Va'al pizeh yuvnu divrei hamedrash shahuva b'taisves. Once we remind ourselves of what was the mindset of the Meraglim, what was really behind their stance that they didn't want to go into Eretz Yisrael, we can now understand with new appreciation on a deeper level the medrash that Tosfos brings down, and the Rebbe cites it again here. Shahayu Aymim Yisrael, that the Jews said, Kevan shenigzar alein shalilikonis eretz mimaisim meraglim. Once they understood that there was a decree, they weren't going to go into Eretz Yisrael because of what happened to meraglim. Shuv eimechayav mitzvahs. So now we can divest ourselves of mitzvahs. We're not mechayiv with mitzvahs. In other words, to them it was either you go into Eretz Yisrael and you throw yourself into the mitzvahs. Specifically, the mitzvahs have to do with agriculture, but all the mitzvahs in general, or you live in the midbar and you live this spiritual life and you're divorced of all the regular constraints and the regular pulls on your time that has to do with making a parnasa and everything else that comes with it, and you just learn Torah. And the Rebbe says that you could even see this in the pshat of the medrash. Mi pashtus lashon hamedrash mashma. If you look, only because the Rebbe is drawing our attention to this, I think, and parsing the text, he says, if you look at the particular wording and the terminology of the medrash, it's understood. They weren't, their intention was not to rebel against God, chas v'shalom, by not doing mitzvahs. Ela shasavru, but they really thought she'ein michuyavin b'mitzvahs. Okay, this was an erroneous thought, but it wasn't that they wanted to rebel. They thought it's not their avodah. Ulachayr tamua. Ma ta'am hakasal kidaitach shalahem. So this is a wonder. What is the basis of this thesis? That if they don't go into Eretz Yisrael, they're not mechuyev mitzvahs b'chlal. And the Rebbe says, it would be one thing if they would have said, we're not mechuyev mitzvahs anymore because through this sin, we have entered into, we're condemned to death. Maybe you would have been able to explain their thesis. Okay, it would be difficult. It would be a stretch, but maybe you could say, because they were already destined for death, they were consigned for death, they're considered like a dead man already, so they have no obligation. Okay, but that's not what they said. They didn't say, we're as good as dead, we're not mechuyev mitzvahs. What was the basis of their thesis? Why would they not be mechuyev mitzvahs? Because they're not going to go into Eretz Yisrael. But based on what we've learned above, the Rebbe says we might say, this is exactly what they were thinking. Because from their perspective, the way they saw it, that the main reason for going to Eretz Yisrael was in order to be able to practically observe the mitzvahs. Allah b'taitam. So it arose in their mind, it arose in their thought process. If the whole thing of going to Eretz Yisrael is about Mrs. Maisis, but they're not going in because of the Avera with the Meraglim, so they're not Mechuyim. What does this mean? Ha'avoida shel kiyum ha'mitzvahs b'maisa eina shayeches aleim. This avodah, this modality of serving Hashem through practical mitzvahs is not relevant to them. Afilu mitzvahs elu shahayu chayavim behem ad az. Even the mitzvahs that they had gotten earlier, that they were mechuyev in. Ubefrat shekama v'kama tzivuyim nitnu lahem kagdama l'knisa la'aretz. And specifically, they were given certain mitzvahs as a preface to going into the land. Shebeschus mitzvahs elu yikansul Eretz Yisrael. That it would be in the schus of these mitzvahs that they would go in. V'chol avedasa mikan va'elech tiyarak b'limud ha'torah b'machshava v'dibor ein mechuyavim b'mitzvahs. In their mind, they made a cheshbon like this. What's the chidush of going into Eretz Yisrael? What's the main reason to go into Eretz Yisrael? There are so many more mitzvahs, maisias, practical mitzvahs that we're going to be able to do there. But since it's not our lot to go in, so let's throw ourselves into the avodah that is our pathway. Because seemingly, or clearly, the pathway of mitzvahs maisias is not going to be our pathway. So, ein mechuyavim b'mitzvahs. Ubehemshach lazeh. Okay, this is a gorgeous alert here. So to repudiate this erroneous idea as a continuation comes the Mekoshesh Eitzim. Amad v'chilal Shabbos kedei sheyahareg v'yiru acherim. He stood up, he was Mechalal Shabbos, bifar hesya, publicly, in order that he should be killed and others should learn from this. Davar zeh melamed. And so, knowing what we do now, what the Maharsha explained, this teaches shagam inyanim shekol teichnam hu meleches machsheves, that even in a mitzvah, where the main content of the mitzvah has to do with your thought process, it has to do with intention. V'hu asam l'shem shemayim. And in this case, not only did he not have an intention, he didn't need the wood. It was l'shem shemayim. It was v'loy kedei lavar zotanei elyon. It wasn't, God forbid, to trespass God's will. Mikol mokim, still in all, gam bazeh ha'ikar hu ha'maise b'poil. Even in this case, what's underscored is the practical action. V'lechein emeres teres emes shepsak halacha lamatahu shezeu chilul Shabbos she'ein tzarich skila. And teres emes says that halacha adjudicates in this case that it's chilul Shabbos and the punishment is stoning. U'maise zeh limed es b'nei Yisrael shenish'aru az b'midbar. And now this is the deeper understanding of why he chose to do dafka this. Because this taught the Jews that remained in the Midbar, that even though there was a gezerah that they would not go into Eretz Yisrael, mashmaz hadavar hi rak she'ena magim leikar kiyam hamitzvos b'maisa. What this means is that they're not going to come to the ultimate and main manifestation of keeping mitzvahs. And there's a very famous Ramban that talks about how all the mitzvahs that are done in Galos Chutz La'aretz, it's just a tziyun. It's like a sign. But be'emes, you could only do mitzvahs in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so the Rebbe says what Shelach wanted to teach was that even though it's true that they would not reach this ultimate level of mitzvahs maisis, kefi sheyeh be'eretz Yisrael, as it would be later when they would go into Eretz Yisrael, Aval gam etzlam, but also for them, ba'odim b'midbar, when they are still in the desert, mashenageya ba'avoida be'ikar, hu oifin kiyam hadvarim b'maisa b'poel. What is most important and what is most relevant is the way in which you do the mitzvah practically. Kechol sheyesh l'kach makom b'midbar. To the greatest degree that they could do the mitzvahs in the midbar at that time. Lefisha ikar inyan ha-mitzvah, because the main component of a mitzvah is safta v'chibor makadosh baruch hu, is to connect oneself and to solder oneself to Hashem, and this is only hu al yedei ma'isa ha-mitzvah, and this is only something that you could do through a mitzvah itself. That's the sikha for today. And the deeper understanding, not only of the connection of these three things, but why he chose this way to illustrate that mitzvahs maisias are negea to them. And I mean, it's a big question. Otherwise, right? How could he have done such a big avera and consign himself to death? It's kind of like suicide, but
Yeah, but the question